Welcome to Histoire en série en VO, a podcast created by Nicolas Charles and Johan Chanoir in collaboration with Claire Schiano. In this podcast, senior and young scholars look at all the TV shows, past, present and future, to dissect your favorite series content. Histoire en série en VO, a podcast that connects series to history and humanities. Hello everyone, welcome to Histoire en série en VO. Today we're going to discuss the BBC TV show Ripper Street with Florence Largillière. Florence is a researcher specialized in modern European social and cultural history. She's interested in people's history and their experiences of the post-war years, immigration and nationalism. She recently completed a PhD at Queen Mary University of London entitled Conservative Jews and Their Nation, a Comparative Study of France, Germany and Italy from 1918 to 1942. Hello, Florence.
Hi, Claire.
So before we start, can I ask you what led you as an historian to analyze this particular show?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's a bit of a weird one because I don't think my PhD topic and the show are strongly linked. I think I'm really interested, as you said, in people's history and in social history, and I think the show Ripper Street is very much a history of people, of ordinary people, and how ordinary people are impacted or are living through experiencing big changes and historical evolutions. But in terms of more direct links, I don't think there's that many. There's a little bit of Jewish history, and I'm going to talk about it in Ripper Street. So the Jewish community was very important in the East End of London at the end of the 19th century. And of course, I've researched the French, German and Italian Jewish communities at a later time. But so there's a little bit of a link here. I think what led me to analyze this show in particular is more the fact that for me, it's one of the best BBC shows of this past decade. One of my favorite shows, really. It's extremely well written, extremely well acted. Everyone involved really, I think, was passionate about the show itself. Like they tried, so the first two seasons were produced by the BBC, then it had to find another producer, and there was a really large movement online to try to save Ripper Street, and I think that's quite a testimony to the quality of the show. So I think it's more because the show is of an excellent it's really an excellent show, and maybe also because it's with the time period I associated most with, I don't know, London, like the end of the Victorian era. Ripper Street itself, I mean, I'm going to talk about it. It's not so much about Jack the Ripper, but it's very much about the consequences, again, of this period of rich in changes and evolutions and very much of tensions between traditions and modernity. So yeah, it's not directly linked to my research. It's just an era, I think, of changes that I'm really just fascinated by.
Okay, so maybe first of all, can you tell us more about this show? So when does it take place? We spoke about the Victorian era, and what is it exactly about?
Yeah, so the show starts in 1889, 6 months after the murders of Jack the Ripper. So Jack the Ripper, Ripper Street, the link is quite easy to make here. And it focuses on the H Division of the London Metropolitan Police in the neighbourhood, the area of Whitechapel. And so the show is about, it's kind of, at least the first two seasons that I'm going to focus on are very much following a crime of the week pattern. So each week there's a crime that the H Division is trying to resolve, and you follow the three main characters. So Edmund Reed, Detective Inspector Edmund Reed, Sergeant Bennett Drake, and an ex-surgeon of the US Army, Captain Homer Jackson. And so you follow the three characters when they are trying to solve a crime. With, again, the show doesn't put Jack the Ripper at the center. It's not about trying to solve the Ripper murders, but there's still in the background the fact that the H Division and the London Metropolitan Police in general failed to solve this murder, to find the murderer. And you also follow, even though that's more true in seasons maybe 3 to 5, you also follow a few female characters. So you have Madame Long Susan, with at the head of one of the biggest or wealthiest brothels of the East End. You have Rose Erskine, who goes from being one of the prostitutes to being a musical singer, and you have an array of a few more very strong female characters developing a bit later in the show. And as I said, the first 2 seasons that I'm gonna rely on a bit more today are really following this kind of crime of the week format. So the creators of the show use this format of focusing each week on a different topic to put us, or to plunge us in the history of the East End, in the history of Whitechapel. And you have, they're using quite a few anecdotes, or they're finding their inspiration in historical facts and develop them into crimes, actually. So there was this fear in the 19th century, especially in the 1860s, of cholera, of cholera epidemics, and so they used that at the center of one of their episodes. They used the tube and the development and the building of the tube and its consequences for the East End and London in general as the basis for another episode. They use the diamond industry and the kind of the networks of the diamond industry as the foundation for another episode. So each episode is kind of giving you a snippet of what the East End of London was like at the time. And then from season 3, it evolves a bit more into, I would say, maybe a study of characters. And so there's really beautiful storytelling from season 3 onwards, with very complex characters. Again, I really love the show, so I would recommend everyone to watch it. But there's an evolution from the first 2 seasons to season 3 to 5. But all of those seasons, all of those episodes are really taking place in a very historical East End. They haven't tried to romanticize it too much. They haven't tried to embellish it, or on the contrary, to make it look more gothic or more scary than it was. So it is, it is a show that is really taking the East End of London almost as another character. So that's quite a long answer to your question, but that's what Ripper Street is about.
Okay, so what are the different themes covered in this show?
I mean, there's a really wide diversity of themes covered, and I think so. I've listed a few when I was talking about how each week focuses on a different crime, and so each week you kind of have another snippet of East London history. I think the diversity of the themes covered is also one of the reasons why the show is so rich for historians. So the first season, for example, covers social inequalities, the development of photography, prostitution, which of course is going to be quite a central theme, anti-Semitism, eugenics, political corruption, immigration, the role of the press in general, but especially the relationship between the police, the Metropolitan Police, and the press. In the second season, just to give a few examples again, there's the question of the issue of heroin and of the opium dens in the neighborhood of Limehouse. They also look, again, kind of linked to eugenics. They look at the the freak shows and how it was used to kind of illustrate the contemporary theories of degeneration. They look at strikes in London, so the strikes of the match girls in 1889, 1888, and the strikes of the dockers. They look really at really a wide number of topics, covering both social evolution of Whitechapel, the political evolution of the East End, the scientific evolution of really the entire country, if not the entire continent. So they really look at a wide diversity of topics.
All right, this is very interesting. So you said also at the beginning that Jack the Ripper is not exactly at the center of the show. So instead, there is more a focus on the people leading the investigation. So can you tell us more about these people, so the police forces at the time?
Yeah, so exactly. So the goal of the main writer, the creator, Richard Waller, was not to put Jack the Ripper at the center, or even really the murderers. The people at the center are very much the people of the H division, and especially the three characters that I've mentioned, so Edmund Reed, Bennett Drake, and Homer Jackson. The police force in London at the end of the 19th century, well, first of all, they were quite outnumbered. So in 1888, London had a population of roughly 5.5 million inhabitants, and there were 14,000 officers. And 60% of those officers only worked at night. So some of them had other jobs during the day or just chose the night shift. And the thing is, they were quite poorly trained. They were really young. To qualify, you needed to be between the age of 18 and 30 years old. You needed to be at least 1.70 meters, so 5'7". There was an exam to pass and a few days of formation, I think 15 or 16 days to train. But the fact is that there were probably not enough candidates for the number of recruits that the Metropolitan Police was looking for. The pay wasn't great. It was regular, which was a change, especially in the East End, when you had a lot of casual workers working day to day. So that was a big, let's say, a big incentive for people to join the police forces, the idea of being paid regularly. But again, it was very much a weird gathering of former butchers or bakers or tailors or farmhands, so people who had moved to the city and couldn't find another job. And because it was this kind of a weird gathering of people, and also because the selection was not that strict, the fact is that there were huge issues with discipline. So alcohol was really a big issue at the time, leading to problems of violence or relationship with prostitutes when they were supposed to kind of control them or even arrest them. And another consequence of that is that, contrary to the H division showed in Ripper Street, which seems to be able to find the murderers maybe not quite easily, but there's a resolution, like at the end of each episode or at the end of each series, the murderers are found, or the guilty parties are found and usually punished. That wasn't really not the case at the end of the 19th century in real London. Very few of the people arrested were going to the courts, and when they were, it was usually for really small crimes. So because they had stolen something rather than because they had murdered. And for example, just to give a few numbers, and again, that's where Ripper Street, the show, may be a bit far from the real East London, but in 1887, there were only 8 people convicted for murder, when of course there were many more murders in London at the time. So that's, again, it's perfectly understandable why Richard Waller, the creators of the show, wouldn't want to represent this kind of police force, because that would completely go against the storytelling that they wanted to, or the narrative structure that they wanted to create. If you want a kind of if you want to put a police division or the H division in that case at the center of your show, they need to be quite effective, or you're never going to have, again, never going to have a story to tell. But yeah, that's where the historical accuracy might be a bit, let's say, a little bit more blurry. The H division itself, so the division that the show focuses on, was responsible for policing quite a small area of London, roughly more than 1 square mile. But in that 1.5 square mile, there were 67,000 people. So it was a very crowded area. And quite, I mean, even though there's a little bit of prejudice and a little bit of stereotyping in presenting the East End or Whitechapel as this very dangerous, very murderous place, the fact is that it was a place where crime was quite common. So they had a lot of people to take care of in a very small space, and a lot of crime to deal with.
All right. So the creators really tried to build their show on historical accuracy, which is not always the case on TV. So what can you tell us about this historical accuracy in Ripper Street?
Yes, of course. So yeah, as I said, Richard Warlow, it was important for him that not necessarily that the show represented everything true. So I think in general, most creators of period dramas are not looking for perfect historical accuracy. They're not creating documentaries. They're very much, again, it's storytelling. It's trying to invent a story and trying to fit it in this historical context. Richard Warlow wanted to have a really good idea of what had happened actually at the time. So he surrounded himself with a few historical consultants, and what he wanted to know is what he could throw away and what he had to keep, so that the show wouldn't be completely, fantastical. So for him, knowing the history, knowing what had really happened, this knowledge can allow the creators of any kind of TV show to really choose what you keep, what you put on the side, what maybe you can use that might be a little bit ahistorical. So choosing, there's a couple of examples that I could potentially come back to where he uses things or inventions that were actually from the early 20th century, and he puts them in the 1890s because he needs them for the crime of the week that he's trying to develop. So he uses history at the development level, at the research level, to really know, if he throws away something, it is not done because he hasn't done the research. It is done because, on the contrary, he has done the research and has judged that this part of history is not crucial to the storytelling that he is putting in place. So to give an example, there's a couple of episodes where Joseph Merrick, also known as Elephant Man, is quite an important character in the show. And in terms of historical truth, Joseph Merrick was a resident of the London Hospital at the time. And when he was traveling outside of London, he was often protected by a police guard. And what the creators of Ripper Street decided to do with this knowledge is that they decided to use this police guard and to make it a police guard coming from the H division. And so, again, it's trying to intertwine real history and the history of the show in a way that seems logical and also believable. But what matters most for the creators, and especially for Richard Warlow, is not so much that was it true that Joseph Merrick was protected by people from the H division? That's quite difficult to know. What matters most is very much to show through Joseph Merrick, through this history of Elephant Man, all the big questions that were going through Victorian minds at the time. So these ideas of eugenics, of monstruosity, of this belief that physical appearances, body shapes were a representation, a suggestion of what was inside someone. So this idea that your external appearance was a representation of your mind and of your morality. So it's not so much whether the show would respect to the letter the historical truth, it's how it's using the broader history to highlight certain big issues and certain big questions of the time. Another thing where really the show is really careful is dialogue. So Richard Waller, the main creators of the show, really wanted the sound of the past. He had been really influenced by the TV show Deadwood, which I haven't watched, but which apparently is really careful about getting this accent and tone and vocabulary. And so he made the same effort. He read a lot of newspapers of the time. He read a lot of police reports so that he would be able to find phrases or the same kind of structure in the spoken language. And if you watch the show and if you're careful or if you pay attention to Edmund Reed's, his speech patterns really replicate the way police express themselves in their written narratives. So again, it's using history in a way that may be slightly anachronistic, or maybe not anachronistic, but slightly maybe a little bit, I was going to say weird, I'm not sure that's the right word, but the fact is nobody talks in the way that they write. And so using written sources to influence the way you write speeches or you write spoken discourse is slightly, maybe slightly ahistorical. But the fact is that if you watch the show, the vocabulary, the lexicon used, they really try to get this kind of sound of the past. And then there are a few embellishments and inaccuracies that I could develop potentially. But it's, again, very, very rich shows for historians.
Okay, this is absolutely fascinating. And can you maybe give us some example about some historical details, some environment thing that are really built on historical accuracy?
Yeah, so I think in addition to the diversity of topics that are covered in the show, which most of them were really issues at the time. So I've mentioned in the intro to this podcast, I've mentioned eugenics, which was really a growing theme. I've mentioned immigration. So the East End of London is really this kind of, because that's where the docks were, that's where most people were coming from. And also, if you didn't have the wealth to move forward into London or to move west into London, then you would stay in the East End. So it's it's one of the most diverse areas of London, and still to an extent today. So all of that is very much representative of what was happening at the time. You also have, for historians, I think, often when you look at Jack the Ripper, you focus very much on the murderer himself, or trying to decide who is the murderer. And that's something that the show is not doing. But what it is doing is trying to see what the memory, or the memory of the failure, really, what kind of influence this memory would have on the police forces, how it could potentially influence their violence because they don't want to fail again, how it would make them maybe a bit more uncertain about the way they conduct their work. So that's quite interesting to kind of move away from who did it into and focusing on what would be the consequences of such a huge failure at the time. But maybe more for historians. I think one aspect that I found really interesting was the relationship between the press and journalists, and the police forces, journalists and the police forces, and how, which is really true, how they were trying to compromise and how journalists would use the police forces to sell their newspapers, but how the police forces would also use the journalists to get information for their cases. So it was not hatred. There were actually quite of a trade here, a trade of services. It's also a show that looks at the evolution of the police force and its modernization, slow and steady modernization. Again, maybe a little bit embellished. I'm not sure the police force of the East End would be the first one to change, but it's quite an interesting thing to look at through 5 seasons. That being said, I think for historians, probably, or at least what was the most striking to me watching the show is very much the visual the visual wealth of the show. You really feel watching it that you're immersed in a Whitechapel that is quite far from the grey and browns that we tend to have in mind when we think of the poorest areas of London at the time. So it's very colourful, it's full of people. There's really been in the show an intention, all the creators and of course all of the crew in charge of costumes and makeup were really careful to again to show how colourful East Londoners could be, how the places, as well as you said, the environment, same thing. There's been a lot of research in there, and of course it's the East End, it's small streets, dark streets, because there's a lot of industries, there's a lot of smoke and fog. But still you have a lot of attention to details, and so you're going to have a lot of posters of the time. You're going to have posters advertising for music halls. You're going to have traces of this political evolution, so traces of the growth of socialism and communism. You're going to have so many small things that you can actually discover again watching the show second time. Going to have news stuck on the walls because not everyone could buy newspapers. So yeah, the environment is very much has been so well researched. I think that watching the show you get a better idea, and probably I think from what I've read, a more accurate idea of what the East End of London could look like at the end of the 19th century. And that being said, so yeah, there is a lot in the show that is either historically accurate or really close to what could have happened. There are also quite a few embellishments. And for example, if we look at Homer Jackson, is very much a character that he's maybe the least believable character. At the same time, his place in the storytelling makes perfect sense, and he is really useful to the show. But for the fact is that it would probably have been, so Captain Homer Jackson is an ex-surgeon, and he's more or less used in the show as the in charge of a forensic laboratory, which probably would not have been a thing in any police station, but specifically in Whitechapel at the end of the 19th century. So that's a little bit of an embellishment here. You also have an episode focusing on a lobotomy experiment. Lobotomy was not a thing at the end of the 19th century. Again, something that was used. So it's something that the creators kind of stole from later in the 20th century and included or kind of, imported into the end of the 19th century. And I think maybe, or at least for some of the historians who have watched the show, appreciated it, but also slightly, well, it's not so much a criticism, just a remark. The fact is that it is a show about the 19th century, which is strongly influenced by the 21st century and also by the TV shows of the 21st century. And for example, Dr. Jessica Hinz has described it as CSI in the 19th century. And I think that's quite a good description, because it is very much looking at crime through a very scientific lens. So it's a 19th century scientific lens, but it's still trying to see how scientific expertise would help people resolve murders. And it's also again, the show is very conscious of the limits of physical evidence, but it's still showing 19th century inspectors really engaging with the theme of contemporary science and all of those questions around identity, surveillance, again, scientific expertise, technologies. So bodies become the site of biological evidence. And it's all about finding those small traces, and that's probably a step away from what you would expect of a period drama. So all of that to summarize, I would say, in terms of how rich the show is for historians, the diversity of topics is probably the main, at least what was the main attraction for me. Then the richness or the wealth of the representation, the costumes, the environment, the attention to details was another aspect. And then, of course, there's going to be embellishments, and there's going to be inaccuracies, and there's going to be a little bit of, the influence of the shows that were and still are very popular now, which are all of those crime shows and quite scientific crime shows.
Okay, so as we've just seen, Rupert Street takes place in East London, which is an area of constant evolution at the time. So in what particular fields can we observe such an evolution?
I would say there's 4 or 5 main areas that we could focus on. In the show, there's a lot of scientific changes that are shown, a lot of technological evolutions. There's also a social evolution, political evolution, and then the big topic, or one of the big topics, is, of course, immigration, because again, the East End of London was one of the most diverse areas of the city, if not of the entire country. So to start with scientific evolution, which links quite nicely to this short discussion about the forensic aspect of the show, science and technologies in the show are always presented with a degree of ambivalence. And there's never or rarely an invention that is only used for good or only used for crime. So innovations and science in general is always shown as something that can be used for the best intent, or with the best intentions, or with the worst intentions. And some of those examples are, so they talk about, they show the development of the tube and of tramways. They look at, I think in the first or the second episode, at photography and the use of photography, which is a beautiful invention of the end of the 19th century, but they look at its use in pornography. They look at eugenics, quite difficult to find the good use of eugenics, but they look at eugenics and all the big questions that were asked at the time. And they also look at electricity, which was, again, something that we consider, of course, as a given, but at the time was just a topic that was raising a lot of questions. So if we look at the tube and the development of the tube, so in 2 episodes, the tube is quite an important actor, almost, or an important player in the show. So in the first episode, you have the 2 of the main characters, Edmund Reed and Bennett Drake, are taking the tube, or talking about the tube, which is slowly being built, and it's a really good and the creator used this short dialogue of those 2 main characters talking about the tube to show the 2 faces of, or maybe the 2 main opinions at the time about the tube, about the Metropolitan. And so for Bennett Drake, this idea that you could just take a train and go from the east end of London to the west end so fast is almost against nature. You're kind of made to stay where you are. While for Edmund Reid, it means that the city can now spread, and that Londoners, and especially Londoners from the East End, can finally stop living like rats. So for him, it's the best example of modernization. It's going to give people more opportunities. For Bennett Drake, it goes against tradition. And so you really have, throughout the show, this tension between, again, as I said, between traditions and modernization. But the show is also really good at showing that this modernization that many of us would or do appreciate today had sometimes dire consequences for the population. And in an episode, same thing in the first season, it is showed that even though the tube would be able to link different boroughs of London and be able to allow people to leave their kind of cramped East End to move somewhere else or to find jobs somewhere else. It also meant that you needed to destroy hundreds of accommodations to be able to build the tube or to build the electricity center that would feed the tube. And so, of course, this is linked to something I'm going to talk a bit later, which is all of those modernization, especially when they were taking place in very crowded areas, would lead to displaced population, or populations that would lose their accommodations, but that would also lose their networks, their friends, their families. It had a lot, again, of consequences. And also the way they were displaced was sometimes far from ideal. They were bought, like they were there was a little bit of corruption, but sometimes they were forced out. They weren't always given alternative accommodation. So it really shows both sides, let's say, of this aspect of modernization. Then same thing with the evolution of photography. The first episode really showed the fascination of Edmund Reid for the invention of the camera, and especially the camera as in a film camera that is kind of the first film camera that is invented by one of the people he's running after or he's chasing, really. But again, this beautiful modern instrument is used for crime. So it's used to film what was called at the time and still is called snuff films. So pornographic films that often ended with a faked or real homicide. So it's this always this tension between what technology can do for good, what it can do for crime, but also between tradition and modernity. And I've talked a little bit about eugenics with the case of Joseph Merrick. It's a theme that comes back a little bit in the show because, again, it was such a central theme at the end of the 19th century, and very much you have this mention of Arnold White, who was one of the main maybe not thinkers. I don't really want to use the word scientist, but one of the let's say scientists with quotation marks here that developed this idea of eugenics and thought that to solve London's issues, it was overcrowded and it was quite dirty and really unhygienic, the solution would be to sterilize the unfittest, to ban early marriages, to control immigration, to promote immigration. And so again, you have in a couple of the episodes, you really have this tension between the issues that you can see in the East End, the fact that, yes, it is overcrowded and some of those people will never have a better life. And at the same time, it is completely unthinkable for Edmund Reid and the people around him to just apply eugenics to this area of East London. So again, a very interesting tension. And just to finish on the scientific evolution or the scientific changes that are shown in Ripper Street, I think electricity is another one of them that is quite an interesting thing to zoom in, because there's, again, it's how first of all, it's still this question of the tension between traditions and modernity, but it's also a good example of how the creators of the show have used something that did exist, this what was called the battle of currents, I think, between AC, so alternating current, and direct current, AC and DC. And so the war of the currents, that was a real thing. I think there's been a movie made on it in the US. And so the creators of the show just use that historical fact, bring it in the East End of London, and use that as the foundation of one of their episodes, and really show, again, the fact that for people who wanted to bring electricity to as wide a population, as large a population as possible, the idea behind bringing electricity to people was to bring light to the streets, but also peace to the home. So this idea that modernization would mean, or would bring peace and quiet and civilization almost to some of those areas of London that were often seen as quite criminal or even extremely dangerous. And so it's very much, again, this use of something that did happen, this war of the currents, using it in this much smaller context of East London to show how what were the ideas surrounding electricity and modernization. At the same time, it's also showing the more controversial, or maybe not controversial, but the sadder aspects of modernization, which is you had two currents, AC and DC, competing. There were huge amounts of money behind those two different industries. And so, of course, there was a lot of fighting, and this fighting or this competition between those two currents and between those two, let's say, capitalist institutions, were also led to the murder of at least one person. So again, it's never all black and white in this show, which is another thing I really like. I'm going to stop here for the topic of scientific evolution.
And maybe also you can say something about political evolution at the time.
Yeah. So I think, and maybe here mixing political and social evolution. So the political evolution that is the most visible in Ripper Street, and again, perfectly in line with what was happening at the time, is the development of socialism, communism, and trade unionism. The first thing, again, to know is that the East End of London was a neighborhood, a working class neighborhood. So as I said, it's the area of London where the docks were. It's also, like in many cities, the industries are placed in the east. So same thing happened in London. So it was a working class area, and it was also a place where work was quite difficult to get. So even though there had been the Industrial Revolution, the fact is that there were more workers than jobs, and so of course there was a lot of exploitation, casual workers, so workers who were employed by the day rather than being employed with a stable position. There were a lot of immigration, which means that employers had a choice of people they could pay less or they could exploit again. And so it's not that surprising that you would have the right that socialism, communism, and trade unionism would develop in those neighborhoods. Another thing also, and I'm going to maybe come back to it later on, is that one of the communities that moved to East London at the end of the 19th century was the Jewish community coming from Eastern Europe, and often, not all of them, but a number of them were quite active or were members of socialist organization or hold really strong socialist ideals or anarchist ideals. So you had both because of the conditions of work or the working conditions in East London, but also because of people who arrived in East London, you had quite a perfect, let's say, pressure cooker for socialism and communism. One of the fear, again, taking a step back from the show and talking about the wider context, so in 1870-71, you had the Paris Commune, and London, but England in general, was slightly terrified that such a thing could happen in London. Communism was growing, the social social demands were growing among the working classes, and so you had this fear that the working classes would unite and would threaten the ways of life, or just threaten the higher classes, the middle classes, the aristocracy, etc. And you had a few events, a few moments where this endemic problem of the poor were highlighted. So you had a couple of strikes that happened at the end of the 19th century that really highlighted that the working class first was exploited and second was starting to unite. And then you had the survey by Charles Booth, which showed, first of all, that yes, the East End of London was really poor, but it was a bit more complex than what was imagined before. There were areas of wealth within Whitechapel. It was much more diverse. It wasn't all, again, it wasn't all black and white, but one other finding of Charles Booth's survey was that the revolution was sparked by educated workers, not by the casual poor. So it was also quite frightening for wealthier Londoners to see that it wasn't a question of education, it was a question of changing the working and living conditions. So coming back to Ripper Street now, there's two strikes that are shown in Ripper Street. Well, the first one is not directly shown, but the aftermath is shown. So in 1888, you have the strikes of the match girls. So it's this industrial action that was taken by women and teenage girls that were working at a match factory in East London, and they were asking for better working conditions. So they were working 14 hours a day, they were poorly paid, they had there was a system of fine that was extremely unfair, and that's on this last aspect that Ripper Street, the show, is focusing on. There were also health complications with working in a match factory. So match factories were using white phosphorus, which was extremely dangerous for people and could cause cancers of could cause cancer. And the show, so Ripper Street, doesn't really focus on the strike itself because it happened before the show starts, but it shows it focuses on the health complications, and it looks at this group of women. I can't remember exactly which episode, but it looks at a group of women who decided to avenge themselves, and so their faces are completely destroyed by the phosphorus, by the cancer, and they decide to just go and kill the people responsible for that. But again, the link is made between the strikes of 1888 and the lack of consideration of those workers, of those female workers, and it is also made again between the scientific kind of revolution using white phosphorus and the consequences that could have for the workers, and in this case the female workers who were dying from it. But you also had a little bit of historical inaccuracy in that the fight against white phosphorus doesn't happen in 1889, 1890, it happens later. And to talk a bit about the dock strikes, same thing. The dock strikes were a very important movement which broke out in 1889. It resulted in a victory, so it was quite rare to have successful strikes at the time, but this one resulted in a victory for the strikers. It established strong trade unions, and really in the show you can see the influence again of Jewish socialism. You can see how a majority of the strikers were unskilled workers. You can also see that it was quite a peaceful movement. You had a few elements that were trying to maybe to lead to violence, but most of the strikers were quite peaceful, were quite orderly and well behaved. And you also see in the show in Reaper Street the celebratory nature of the demonstration, which is a very important aspect, and I think something that again is well represented. So you had bands, you had a good relationship with the police and the public, you had those decorated floats. So I think in terms of the representation of the political evolution, Reaper Street really gives us again snippets of what was happening at the time that are really close to the historical truth, with again quotation marks around a truth. But yeah, and leading to that, so leading to this political evolution, so this growth of socialism and trade unionism, is the social evolution. So you have, at the time, you really have this fear of class conflict and social disintegration. Mm-hmm. The East End was very much, as I said, because of immigration and because of the poor working conditions, a perfect place for socialism to grow and spread. And so quite a few charities and caritative associations were trying to solve the issue by just improving the living conditions of the East End, or trying to educate East Enders. And again, that's something that is visible in the show. So you have the wife of Edmund Reed works for a charity which is trying to get prostitutes out of sex work. And so they really try. So you had quite a number of charities, often led by middle class or higher classes women, who were trying to save the women of the East End. But a lot of these charities really believed in the theory of self-help. So it was this idea that the poor should be educated, but then they should improve themselves. And you also had, again, another thing that's really important at the end of the 19th century, you have this evangelical ideas that, and so the role of the church is also central. And yeah, something that is very visible in the show, Mrs. Reed works for a charity that is linked to the church, and the church becomes really the main instrument of charity. And so you have, on one hand, this the role of the middle classes, and especially of middle class women in the East End, trying to improve people, trying to almost force people to improve themselves. And on the other hand, you also have the population of East London trying to improve East London at their level. So after the murders, after the Jack the Ripper murders, there had been a committee called the Vigilance Committee, created by a man called George Lusk. And again, that's another moment that the creators of the show use and then just move in time. So this Vigilance Committee that is shown is one episode of Reaper Street did exist and was created by George Lusk, and the name George Lusk is used in the show. And the goal of the Vigilance Committee was to protect the streets of East London. They believed that the police was quite useless, and that to protect East London, you needed East Londoners. And so those men were they were all men, obviously, but they were quite concerned that the killings were affecting businesses in the area. So they unpicked unemployed men, and they used those men to patrol the streets of the East End every night. They paid them a small wage, and they were quite violent, like they had no moral code at all. And this Vigilance Committee makes an appearance in the show a year or so after it was actually disbanded. So it's a good example on one hand of how the population of East London wasn't had agency, and on the other hand, how the creator of the show is using these historical facts or these historical events or movements and putting them in their stories, I think.
Yes, and we also see at the time some new forms of entertainment.
Yeah, and I think the main one here, and there's two. I could have talked about the representation of prostitution and brothels in the show, and I think, potentially it could be an entire topic for Histoire en série to look at. But what I chose to focus on was much more is linked to the character of Rose Erskine. So one of the main entertainment industry in the East End was the music hall. It was the most popular form of entertainment at the time. There were different sizes of music halls for different publics. It attracted everyone, really. There were class differences in where people would go, but there was no class difference in what people were interested in watching. So you had small ones, cheap ones with amateur singers, and then you had bigger ones and more expensive ones when you had almost like the stars of the time. But in 1875, there were 375 music halls across the city, and close to half of them were actually established in Tower Hamlet, which is one of the which is the larger borough where Whitechapel is. And it really was that the culture of the music hall is really part of the East End popular culture and Whitechapel as well. And you can really, it is a recurrent or a recurring actor in Ripper Street, because that's where you can see the evolution of one of the main characters, but also that's used to show this tension that I've mentioned quite a few times already between traditions and modernization, the fact that women could work in musicals, they could earn their life, they could be a bit more independent. It was one way they could do that, but again, the tension with tradition was that the men surrounding those women were not always fully appreciative, or it's also a good way to show, I think, gendered relationships, and how it was quite difficult for women to find work without being either too sexualized or seen as traitors to their genders. So I think really the musical, as shown in Ripper Street, is very representative of what it was at the time. So you had this diversity of numbers that were shown. You had different musicals, different levels or different qualities of musicals, but the fact is that everyone wanted to go, and you had, as I said, no difference and no class difference when it came to the musical as an industry. You had differences in terms of where people went, but that was it, and that's also really well shown in Ripper Street, the show.
Also, one last theme you've already mentioned is immigration and displaced population.
Yeah, so the populations were, so I'm going to start with the displaced populations. So the populations were displaced, at least in the show, mostly by modernization. And that's also something that did happen in the East End of London, to build cleaner and more hygienic housing, or to make space for railways, for tramways, or to set up those electricity factories or centers. You needed space, and so you needed to destroy. Sometimes they were slums, so they had been built really quickly and were quite easy to destroy, or sometimes they were housing that had been built in the decades before, that housed sometimes hundreds of people and family, but needed to be destroyed again, either to make place for cleaner housing or for all of those new modern institutions. And something that is quite visible in the show, in both season 1 and season 2, is first how those displacements were necessary for the East End to be modernized, but also, as I said a bit earlier, how modernization would have a negative impact on people in the very short term. And so, for example, you have the Central and Southeast Electricity Commission that decides to, what they probably thought, or some of the people involved probably thought, was a good deed. So they needed to destroy a small neighborhood of the East End of London to put their own industry, but they decided to build new houses, new accommodation on the side. So that was the good deed aspect of it. But the fact is that those new accommodations were often much more expensive, and again, you don't only destroy housing, you also destroy networks, and you destroy family networks, friendship networks. You also push people away potentially from their places of work. And if they enter the system of the poorhouse, then it's also very difficult to get out of it. One of the consequences of displaced population for women, for example, was that they sometimes had to enter sex work, not necessarily as a full-time profession, but just to be able to eat or to house themselves. So these aspects are quite well shown in the series. But another aspect of it was that another thing that the show is trying to highlight is also how it was. Yeah, one other thing that the show is trying to do is to highlight how there was a tension between people like middle class people who thought they were doing good, and working class people who saw their entire environment completely destroyed, and sometimes how those working class people were completely ignored and just not taken into account. So many of the railways, for example, were passed through some of the poorest working class areas because the land was cheap, and the landlords were very easily persuaded to sell the lands with bribes. Potentially, tenants were also bought out of their houses. And that's how some of the most congested and impoverished sites of London were cleared. But one of the side effects of that is that you would clean one area, but then the crowds would also have to move elsewhere. So you would kind of just move the slums away from what you had just cleaned. But the displaced poor still needed to ideally stay close to their place of work. So to summarize this point on displaced population, you had, as often with Ripper Street, many tensions are represented. The tension between good intentions and their repercussions for the people the people who were targeted by these good intentions. You have the dire consequences for the working class, pause of modernization, you had also the fact that you could try to improve something in one place, but you would just kind of push the problem away. So there is sometimes a little bit of pessimism, I would say, in Ripper Street, in that it's very hard to solve the issue of poverty, of overcrowdedness, and of slums in London. And maybe to finish, I think one of the last theme that I could talk about, there are many themes to talk about when you study Ripper Street, but one of the last theme would definitely be, I think, immigration. I'm going to talk really quickly about Chinese immigration because it's quite an important theme of the second season, and then I'll develop a bit more about on the topic of Jewish immigration, which is a bit closer to my PhD topic and which will allow us to go full circle. So the Chinese immigration, that's maybe, at least to me, and I'm sure many fans of the show would disagree with me, but it's sometimes represented in a bit of a cliched way. So Chinese immigration is presented to us through opium and the opium dens, and they were important spaces. I mean, I'm not saying that the show lied about it or exaggerated the role of opium dens at the time, but it's more or less the only thing that we see about Chinese migrants. But one thing that is the way it is used, or the relatively interesting way it is used, is that for Edmund Reed, so the police inspector that we follow the most closely, the opium dens are an example of how British imperialism corrupted a population or a nation that was, to him, extremely advanced. And you can see that in how the police forces of Limehouse, of the Limehouse district or the Limehouse division, led by a man called Jedediah Shine, is also corrupting the Chinese community of the East End. So Limehouse is also in the East End. But in terms of immigration, I would say this first example of the Chinese immigration in the East End might be slightly stereotypical, at least to me. And that is in contrast with the representation of the Jewish community. I really think that Ripper Street did a really good job at representing the Jewish community of the East End of London. The first thing that they show is that anti-Semitism was already very present in the minds of people, but just extremely visible as well. In the first season, the second episode, you have this anti-Semitism, which is still linked to this idea, to this religious idea that the Jewish people was the people who had killed Christ. You also have this, so in the second episode, Edmund Reed and his team are chasing a young boy who is called now Thomas Gover, but his real name is actually a Jewish name, and it is said very explicitly that he had to change his name to an English name so that he could survive in an English world. So there was still this idea that a Jewish name would have meant maybe not persecution, but definitely stigmatization. And at the end of the second season, you have another episode where the anti-Semitism and the violence between Christian communities and Jewish communities is used by a sect, but same thing, you can see how anti-Semitic prejudices were ready to be used by Christian communities, and also how it was really easy to manipulate anti-Semitic sentiment against the Jewish community. A second aspect of the Jewish community, or a second aspect of the Jewish community that is well shown is, as I've said before, the how they were quite involved in socialist groups and in the rise of socialism in the East End. So you definitely had this element of almost of Yiddish culture that led to these groups of Jewish socialists and Jewish anarchists, because a number of intellectuals who had to move away from Russia or from Eastern Europe were also part of those larger socialist organizations. And in the show, you can see how some of those Jewish men joined the International Working Men's Educational Club, or how they participated, in the trade unions. There was actually a strike, a Jewish strike, or a strike organized by Jewish tailors in 1889. So this political aspect of the Jewish community is also well shown. And something that is less visible might be what they were, the kind of tension, again, this word is coming back quite a lot in my talk, but this tension between the and that's getting closer to my PhD topic, this tension between newcomers, so the Jewish people who had come from Eastern Europe in the 1880s, 1890s, who most of them lived in East London, Aldgate, Whitechapel and Stepney. And on the other hand, you had a very well settled or well integrated English Jewish community or Anglo-Jewish community. And that's not really visible in the show, but you had a little bit similar to how the middle class charities or middle class women were trying to help working class people to improve and were trying to educate them. You also had a lot of philanthropy, so philanthropist organizations which were led by well integrated Jewish institutions or well integrated Jewish people, and they were really trying to assimilate or integrate those Jewish newcomers. So you had a lot of efforts made in terms of health, education, housing. Those Jewish philanthropists were responsible, for example, for hospitals being built in East London, for schools, universities, libraries, even museums. So I think it could have been, of course, the show cannot look at everything, but it could have been quite interesting to see how the wealthier Jewish community who had settled in England in the centuries before had tried on both to integrate the newcomers for their own good, but also to protect their standing in the general community. And I think this tension between a Jewish community that arrived maybe in the 17th century or was really, really well integrated, felt themselves as, or defined themselves as English rather than Jewish, and those newcomers from Eastern Europe who really defined themselves probably as Jewish first. This tension is also a tension that I studied when I looked at 1920s and 1930s, especially in France, when you had a very well settled and integrated French Jewish community that suddenly in the 1930s had to deal with or was confronted with 200,000 Eastern European Jews moving away from the pogroms or moving away from Nazism. And so that's probably one tension that I would have liked to see portrayed. Of course, again, Reaper Street cannot cover everything. So yeah, I mean, we've only covered a few of the topics we could have, but I really think this huge topic of evolution, of change, of modernization, whether it be scientific, political, social, all linked to population changes, this big topic of change and modernization is definitely, I think, for me, the central one in the show.
Thank you very much, Florence, for this fascinating presentation for Histoire en série en VO. You gave us a very rich depiction of Victorian London and people at the time through this show. So for those who want to watch the show, Reaper Street is available on the BBC or on the French platform MyCanal. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Don't miss a single episode. Join us on Twitter at Histoire en Série and find our guest presentation and bibliography on our website www.histoireenserie.com.
Trouble